Did you know that a bird no bigger than your palm is reshaping the destiny of an entire nation? In the heart of the Sahel, where droughts blister the land and locusts swarm with fury, a revolution is taking flight, not with guns, not with gold, but with feathers. Quail, fragile and forgotten, have become Burkina Faso's boldest strategy for survival. At first glance, these tiny birds seem laughable, easy to miss, easy to dismiss. But sometimes the smallest lives hold the greatest power. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a nation bruised by hunger and foreign dependency began releasing millions of quail into open fields. Not caged, not controlled, free. Like a living whisper of sovereignty scattered across the desert winds. This is not just a policy, it's a defiant act of hope. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It's the future our elders prayed for. Subscribe and stand with us. For an Africa that will never bow again. Because when even the humblest creature can spark a national revival, we must ask, what else have we overlooked? The announcement came not as a suggestion, but as a declaration, loud, unapologetic, and thunderous. In March 2025, standing before a restless crowd in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré unveiled a plan that would raise eyebrows across the continent. While others reached for loans and foreign pesticides, he reached for birds. "We will not wait for salvation to arrive from abroad," he said. "If there are locusts, let there be quail." The plan? Release 20 million quail into the fields, deserts, and villages of Burkina Faso within 5 years. Not as pets, not as lab experiments, but as soldiers, soldiers of sovereignty. Traoré framed it not as an agricultural scheme, but a national mobilization. No cages, no factories. Only wide skies, open fields, and the wild Sahel. To most, it sounded absurd, but the government moved fast. Hatcheries sprang up across 3 major regions, North, Central Plateau, and East, each built to incubate and rear hundreds of thousands of chicks per month. A staggering $45 million budget was allocated to the program's early phase. Construction, training, transport, and veterinary monitoring. Custom trucks were fitted with ventilated crates. Teams of technicians trained villagers on handling the birds. Quail were bred not to be stored, but to be released. And release them they did. What began as logistics soon turned into ceremony. In village after village, crates were lowered gently onto red earth. Elders offered blessings. Women opened the latches with trembling hands. Children chased the birds through the millet stalks, giggling as clouds of speckled wings scattered into the horizon. What was meant to be an agricultural intervention felt more like a cultural rebirth. Within 6 months, over 3.5 million quail had been released, covering 80,000 hectares of farmland. Officials estimated that by year's end, local egg production could exceed 100 million per annum, with meat yield reaching thousands of tons. These were not just projections. They were a direct challenge to the idea that food solutions must come from the outside. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. These birds, small, fast reproducing, hardy, were everything that Western models of development ignored. They didn't require massive land holdings or heavy machinery. They didn't rely on global supply chains or imported feedstock. In their fragility was strength. In their invisibility was power. President Traoré began referring to them in speeches as feathers of freedom. Every egg laid was a blow struck against dependency. Every bird that survived the heat was a reminder that resilience does not have to roar, it can flutter. Reactions rippled quickly through the nation. In rural provinces, farmers watched with cautious optimism as flocks darted between the stalks, pecking at grasshoppers and laying eggs in hidden corners. One elder in Yatenga said, "If they save our crops, I will name my grandson after them." In Bobo Dioulasso, a young woman named Awa built a wooden pen beside her garden and began collecting the first eggs. But in the capital, the plan met laughter. Social media buzzed with memes of quail wearing military helmets. A radio host joked, "Next, we'll send ducks to negotiate with ECOWAS." Intellectuals derided the move as unserious, calling it a distraction from structural reforms. Yet amid the jokes, markets began to shift. The first quail eggs appeared in stalls, cheaper than chicken, richer in nutrients. Mothers boiled them for breakfast. Street vendors fried them by the dozen. Demand outpaced supply. From a dusty hatchery in Kaya to the urban kitchens of Ouagadougou, the project was no longer theory. It was taste, texture, survival. And still, questions lingered. Would these birds truly multiply fast enough to meet demand? Could they survive the Sahel's scorching winds and lurking predators? Would communities embrace the responsibility or let the birds vanish into the wild? Because beneath every wing that took flight was a gamble not just on biology, but on belief. And so, the people waited, watched, wondered. Would the smallest creatures truly carry the weight of a nation's hopes? At first, there was only silence. Then came the laughter, radio hosts poking fun, online sketches of quail in camouflage. Even university professors joined in, labeling the project a rural fairy tale. The idea that tiny birds might stand between a nation and hunger was, to them, a charming delusion. But the silence returned. And this time, it was different. Because then came the evidence. By late 2026, the fields had changed. Farmers began reporting lower locust activity. Children who once picked insects off maize leaves now chased quail instead. And in homes once silenced by hunger, laughter returned. Not the laughter of ridicule, but the laughter of the fed. Millions of eggs were being collected. In Wahiguya, women gathered speckled shells into baskets with pride. In Dori, a mother named Salimata boiled quail eggs for her anemic daughter and watched her recover strength. The capital shifted. Mockery gave way to markets. Vendors sold skewered quail alongside grilled corn. School canteens began incorporating the eggs into meals. Prices dropped, nutrition rose. The project, once dismissed, was feeding a nation. And then, just as quickly, the storm struck. An investigative journalist from Ouagadougou Daily uncovered a confidential set of government contracts. The documents revealed a shocking detail. Foreign agribusiness firms, registered in Europe and the Gulf, had secured rights to purchase up to 60% of Burkina Faso's future quail exports at discounted prices, locked in for 15 years. The outrage was immediate. Protests erupted across the capital. In front of Parliament, demonstrators held placards that read, "Not for sale," and "We feed the birds, they feed the foreigners." Images of quail inside golden cages flooded social media. Call-in shows burned with fury. We raised them. We released them. And now, we are told the eggs are not ours? A woman shouted during a live broadcast. The betrayal cut deeper than policy. It struck at the heart of dignity. For many Burkinabe, the quail were never just animals. They were symbols of rebirth, of independence, of possibility. To learn that foreign firms, many with histories of exploitation, would profit from the very project meant to restore sovereignty was not just an economic concern. It was personal. President Traoré remained silent for 3 days. When he finally addressed the nation, it was not with excuses, but with defiance. The deals were strategic, he said. They ensured financing, veterinary supplies, and market access. But no contract is greater than the will of the people. If the people reject this path, we will walk another. His words calmed some. Others called it political theater. Opposition parties seized the moment, accusing Traoré of hypocrisy, of turning sovereignty into spectacle, of selling national resources in secret. Debates flared in parliament. Youth groups splintered, some standing by Traoré, others demanding his resignation. Internationally, the scandal went viral. Some media outlets praised the people's courage to question authority. Others mocked the chaos, calling it the chicken coup. Analysts in Brussels and Washington debated whether Burkina Faso was ready for agricultural self-determination. In Beijing and Manila, agricultural journals took a different tone. They praised the people, but warned of external capture. Amidst the noise, the question sharpened. Was the Quail Revolution a beacon of independence, or another chapter in the same old story where African resources serve foreign tables? Because for every child fed in Kaya, a cargo ship was being loaded for Dubai. For every mother who built a business in Goa, a boardroom in London toasted another successful partnership. The paradox deepened. The hope had not vanished, but it had been bruised. In rural villages, the birds still sang. In the capital, the chants still rang. But now they were louder, sharper, hungrier for truth. What happens when a symbol of survival is caught in a tug of war between power and people? When the dust settled after the protests, one truth became impossible to ignore. The quail were no longer just birds. They had become politics. They had become economy. They had become the language through which Burkina Faso spoke of its survival and its sovereignty. In the countryside, the transformation was tangible. Women's cooperatives emerged almost overnight. With just a few cages and steady care, mothers turned quail into livelihoods. In Kudugu, a cooperative of 30 women began selling eggs by the crate. Their profits funded school supplies, medical fees, and even the construction of a small classroom. For them, the feathers of freedom were not a metaphor. They were income. Children felt the change most clearly. Schools reported reduced cases of malnutrition as eggs became part of daily meals. Teachers in Bobo Dioulasso noted how pupils seemed more alert, less prone to fainting during long lessons. In families where meat had been a rare luxury, quail skewers became common, even festive. But as diets improved and villages thrived, the political atmosphere in Ouagadougou grew more strained. Supporters hailed Traore as a visionary who had turned ridicule into resilience. Posters of quail alongside his portrait appeared on walls. From fragility comes strength. Yet critics grew bolder. Opposition leaders accused him of selling the nation's future through secretive contracts. They warned of dependency not on foreign aid, but on foreign markets. The divide cut deep. Demonstrations filled the capital's streets. Some carried banners praising Traore as the father of sovereignty, while others chanted, "No more chains." Radio talk shows split audiences down the middle. In cafes, arguments erupted. Was the president a pioneer or a populist with feathers? Meanwhile, government records revealed another layer of complexity. The quail industry, now valued in the billions, was beginning to rival cotton. Burkina Faso's traditional economic backbone. Traders who had once dealt only in cotton and sesame began shifting to quail products. For the first time in decades, the country had an export that did not depend on European subsidies or global price swings. But with that opportunity came the fear of capture. Who truly controlled this new wealth? The people, the state, or corporations abroad? In villages, the contradiction was felt keenly. Awa, the woman who once sold roasted peanuts by the roadside, now ran a thriving stall selling quail skewers. Yet when she heard about the export contracts, she said, "If foreigners take the eggs, what will my children eat tomorrow?" For her, the question was not abstract economics, it was survival. The scandal reshaped not only public trust, but also public imagination. Across Burkina Faso, conversations turned to sovereignty, dignity, and the meaning of independence. Was it merely the absence of colonial troops? Or was it the power to decide what happens to the smallest bird in the smallest village? International organizations weighed in as well. Some praised the grassroots resilience, others warned of health risks and unsustainable growth. But on the ground, the people had already formed their own judgment. The quail were theirs. The project might have flaws, but it had shifted their lives in ways no aid program ever had. The deeper irony was clear. A revolution meant to silence hunger had awakened a louder hunger for justice, for fairness, for dignity. The birds had multiplied, but so had questions. And those questions carried more weight than any feather, because the issue was no longer just about nutrition. It was about who decides what Africa eats, who profits from its innovations, and who shapes its destiny. So let me turn to you, the listener. What do you believe defines true sovereignty? Control over weapons and borders, or control over food and dignity? Share your thoughts below, because one truth remained inescapable. Every egg collected, every child fed, every protest shouted was not just about today's survival. It was about tomorrow's freedom. But could this fragile revolution endure the storms of politics and the temptations of global markets? Or would it collapse, feather by feather, under the weight of betrayal? As the quail spread across Burkina Faso's fields, so too did the ripples spread across the globe. What had begun as a local experiment in food security soon turned into a geopolitical debate. In Washington, analysts first dismissed the initiative as populism, a desperate attempt by a young leader to distract from deeper economic woes. Editorials mocked it as fighting famine with feathers. Yet as data trickled in, rising egg production, falling malnutrition rates, the tone began to shift. Think tanks quietly admitted that food sovereignty, not aid, might become Africa's strongest weapon of resilience. In Europe, the reaction was sharper, tinged with condescension. Commentators in Paris and Brussels sneered at the theatrics of Quail, insisting that Africa's exports could never match European standards. Trade lobbyists warned against opening markets to Sahelian quail, citing concerns over hygiene. Yet beneath the rhetoric lay unease. If such low-cost, high-yield production succeeded, Europe's own farmers might face uncomfortable competition. In Asia, the reception was radically different. Agricultural journals in Japan, China, and the Philippines highlighted the efficiency of quail as a protein source. They pointed out that millions of quail eggs were already consumed daily across Asia, and that Burkina Faso's leap represented not imitation, but innovation. Where Europe saw ridicule, Asia saw opportunity. Orders began trickling in, small at first, then larger, suggesting that the Sahel's exports might soon find a place on Asian tables. And where did the United Kingdom stand? Britain, though no longer a colonial power in name, remained deeply tied to West Africa through aid, trade, and diplomacy. British media covered the story with a curious mix of irony and intrigue. Some tabloids mocked it as the chicken army of the Sahel. Yet policy circles at Westminster were more cautious. Reports from the Foreign Office acknowledged that Burkina Faso's quail industry was becoming a test case for African self-reliance. Behind closed doors, British agribusinesses quietly explored contracts. Feed supplies, veterinary vaccines, and even future export partnerships. For London, the stakes were not just about birds. They were about influence. If Burkina Faso's experiment succeeded, it would embolden other African nations to chart their own course. Less reliant on Western donors, less vulnerable to old colonial leverage. For the UK, the Quail Revolution raised a delicate question. Would it stand as a supporter of African independence, or would it, like others, circle hungrily around new markets? The divergence of responses revealed something deeper than trade. It revealed how the world still struggled to see Africa's solutions as serious. To some, the quail were comedy. To others, they were resilience. But above all, they were proof that Africa's innovations, however fragile, demanded to be taken seriously. And so the question remained, in a world divided between ridicule and respect, would Burkina Faso's fragile wings be recognized as a revolution or dismissed as a passing spectacle? By the third year of the Quail Revolution, Burkina Faso had already rewritten part of its destiny. Hatcheries worked day and night, producing hundreds of thousands of chicks each month. The numbers spoke loudly. Over 15 million quail released, more than 500 million eggs harvested annually, and 50,000 tons of meat consumed or sold. The industry was valued at nearly $2 billion, rivaling cotton, the long-standing economic backbone of the nation. But numbers tell only half the story. The deeper narrative was about choice, Africa's choice. The road ahead was strewn with both promise and peril. On the one hand, quail were proving to be an engine of transformation. Women's cooperatives blossomed, school meals improved, and malnutrition rates fell. Villages that once depended on aid now generated income through small-scale farming and local markets. Across the Sahel, discussions of a protein corridor emerged, an alliance where Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso could share expertise, hatcheries, and trade routes to feed tens of millions. For the first time, it seemed possible that Africa would not just survive famine, but export resilience. Yet the dangers loomed just as clearly. Disease outbreaks reminded people that fragile wings could be wiped out overnight. Dependence on imported feed threatened to shift sovereignty back into the hands of foreign suppliers. And above all, the global market, driven by profit, still circled like a vulture. Would quail remain a weapon of freedom, or would they become just another chain of dependency? Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself admitted the fragility of the path. Sovereignty, he said, does not need to be large. It needs to be fast, fertile, and free. His words echoed across the desert winds, reminding his people that resilience is not measured in size, but in endurance. For Africa, the lesson was bigger than Burkina Faso. It was about daring to trust in local solutions, about reimagining agricultural innovation not as a borrowed model, but as a homegrown revolution. It was about believing that dignity can grow from the soil, multiply with each egg, and carry entire nations on wings too small to notice, until they rise together. The question now lies not just with leaders, but with you, the listener. Should Africa cling to foreign promises, or should it risk everything to walk its own road, however fragile? And as Burkina Faso stands at this crossroads, one truth remains certain. The smallest of birds has forced an entire continent to ask the largest of questions. What will Africa choose? From laughter to livelihood, from fragile wings to fierce resilience, the quail revolution of Burkina Faso has proven one thing beyond doubt. Sovereignty is not gifted, it is earned. Every egg laid, every child nourished, every farmer who dared to hope, together they wove a story that began with feathers but ended with dignity. This was never only about birds. It was about a people's refusal to be mocked, about the courage to look at something ordinary and declare it extraordinary. Captain Ibrahim Traoré once said, "Sovereignty does not need to be large. It needs to be fast, fertile, and free." His words are no longer theory. They live in every village, every market, every household touched by this bold experiment. Across the Sahel, neighbors are watching. Mali, Niger, even markets as far as Lagos and Accra have begun asking, can we too take this path? Can African agriculture become more than survival? Can it become power? This is the challenge and the promise, that Africa's destiny lies not in dependency, but in innovation and courage. And yet, the struggle is not finished. Disease can strike, markets can be manipulated, contracts can betray. The old order still circles, hungry to capture what was meant to be free. That is why the future depends on vigilance, on the determination to defend every victory, no matter how small, against those who would turn freedom into profit. But if there is one lesson that echoes from the deserts of Burkina Faso, it is this: revolutions do not always roar. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they flutter, and sometimes they rise on wings too fragile to notice, until they become unstoppable. So I ask you, what future do you see for this continent? Will the next green revolution come not from billion-dollar laboratories, but from villages where women collect eggs and children laugh with full stomachs? Will the quail remind us that prosperity belongs to those who dare to believe? If this story moves something in your chest, do not scroll past. Like, share, and raise your voice. Subscribe. Our history was silenced for too long. Let us speak our future out loud. Write your blessing in the comments. It can be 3 simple words. Bless Africa. Or it can be one word only. Prosperity. Because prosperity belongs not just to nations, but to families, children, and every voice that still dares to hope. And let it echo. African agriculture, African agriculture, African agriculture, no longer dependent, but free.